Alright, so welcome back. So for this video, I'm going to show you guys how to play the Jack and the Beanstalk from the Tales and Games series. Now, it is important to note that this is a very dexterous game. You're going to be building a beanstalk after all. This is the mini board here, the base of the beanstalk, if you will. And as the beginning part of the setup, you will have one dice already sitting here at the base. That will be the first part of the setup of the beanstalk. But the rest of the time, we will be using these dice, these cylinders here, these basically treasure tokens. I know they look like clouds, and they technically are, but they are called treasure tokens. So we'll be using these, and these dice to build the beanstalk. So because that's the case, it could possibly fall over while you're playing. And that is something that could definitely happen. And if it happens, it could be advantageous to your opponents if it falls over on your turn. So obviously this is very dexterous and definitely not an easy game if you have sort of like a shaky hand. This is definitely not an easy game for you, for sure. But that does not mean it isn't fun, and that does not mean it's not going to be at least challenging in that sense. Now, the object of the game is you're going to want to try to collect as many of these sack of gold treasure cards as you can. And basically, the player who happens to be the richest at the end of the game will be the winner. Now, each player is going to get 7 action cards. So here we have 7 action cards. At the beginning of the game, each player is going to get to look at 3 of these cards. At the top, after they've shuffled them, obviously, they're going to look at 3 of them. And then, after they look at the 3 of them, they're going to decide which one they want to play for the turn, setting it down and setting it aside so nobody else can see what number they have. Okay? Every player who's playing is going to do the same thing. They're each going to choose a card that they want out of the 3. They're gonna set it down like this at the same time. Then once everyone has chosen their card, they will flip it over. Now the player who has the lowest number will go first. And then if you're playing with more than 2 people, obviously it's going to go lowest to highest. So that's how it's going to work. Okay? Now, obviously, this is once again a very dexterous game. So there could be definitely some advantages to going first or last or even in the middle, depending on how high the beanstalk is, of course, obviously. But you'll notice on these cards here, we have 3 different things on the cards. You'll notice this part here with the green cubes next to the numbers, which are basically obviously the dice, right? That tells you how many you can roll on your turn. So when it's your turn, so let's say obviously this player here which is me, isn't going first. It's this player here who has the 2. They have a choice to either roll 1 dice or 2 dice, okay? Now, if I had this card here and I was rolling, I have the choice to roll 1 dice or 3 dice. That would be my choice, okay? So I could either roll 1 or 3. And of course, maybe when there's not much of a beanstalk, rolling 3 might be a good idea. Of course, that may not always be the case, as you will see with the dice too. Obviously, there will be advantages to just rolling 1 dice on your turn as well, especially as the height of the beanstalk gets higher and the possibility of it falling over increases as you go higher, for sure. And so that's why that's kind of an interesting strategy. Then you'll also notice that on the bottom parts of the cards, these are extra abilities that each of the cards have, and they're only for the expert variant. So we're not going to discuss the expert variant right now, but that's what they're for. So you don't have to worry about anything below these numbers here if you're not playing the expert variant. Okay, so that's basically how that would work. Now, obviously, let's just play how... first let's talk about the dice. So you're going to roll these dice. And each of these different faces are going to do different things. you'll notice this has an eye on it. One eye on your dice doesn't do anything. But if you get two eyes, meaning you rolled more than one dice, and you have basically two of these dice that are now like this, your turn is basically over, okay? What's going to happen is, if you had rolled more than two dice, whatever, doesn't matter what you rolled, so if this is what you had rolled, this will just get sent back to the pool of dice. That will not be used to build the beanstalk. These two will go onto the beanstalk, and your turn will be over, essentially. Nothing else will happen on your turn. So if you had rolled a certain amount of good dice, like, for instance, this here, and you were hoping to get some treasure or something like that, obviously that's not going to happen because you basically just woke the giant up by drawing, two giant eyes. So you'll have to put the dice like this onto the beanstalk, and then your turn will be over. And then it'll be the next player's turn, and they will get to, obviously, take their turn rolling dice and building this beanstalk. But that's what's going to happen if you get two of those eyes. If you just get one, then you don't have to worry about it, okay? You get one, you don't have to worry about it. Unless, of course, you get a dice that has this right here. If you get this side of the die with a dice and the plus symbol on it, you have the option to actually roll an additional dice. So let's say you have some dice here, and this is what you have right here, and you decide, you know what, I want to roll more dice. You can do that. You can roll more dice. And so what you'll do is you'll just take another dice from the dice pool, and you'll roll it. And then you'll add it to the beanstalk. All of the dice, one at a time. If you roll another one with that plus symbol on it, then you can once again roll another dice until you stop getting this, obviously, this side of the dice here. But basically, there is no end to how many times that can happen. If you just somehow keep rolling this side of the dice, and you keep rolling dice and dice and dice, and there are no more dice left, that is fine. Because if there are no more dice left, then that's one of the ways that the giant's castle will get put at the top of the beanstalk. And then provided that nothing happens to the beanstalk, you'll get an extra sack of gold for being the player who basically got to put the giant's castle at the very top of the beanstalk. Now, obviously, if the beanstalk falls over, there are definitely some repercussions for the player that, happened to knock it over because of their clumsiness. Or if it just happened to fall over on their turn accidentally. An unknown earthquake from somewhere. So obviously, if you're playing with a bunch of players, you'll want to make sure your friends don't bump the table on accident. Or was it purpose? Who knows? But you don't want to do that, obviously, because that will obviously ruin the game, and it'll ruin your turn for sure. Of course, it'll make everybody else happy if you were going to continue playing. But obviously, you don't want to bump the table in any way on your turn. So you have to be very careful with this game, for sure. Now, there are other, obviously, sides that you'll need to know about as well. Okay, so here we have basically the sack of gold side of the dice. If you roll this side, what you're going to do is you're going to get to put it on the beanstalk. So you'll put all of the dice you're going to roll will go onto the beanstalk. Okay? But of course you can kind of decide how you're going to do that. If you have more than one, you can choose which ones you're going to put on first, etc., etc. But if you were to roll this one, you would put it onto the beanstalk, and then you would put the sack of gold, obviously from your treasure token here that looks like a sack of gold. You'll put it, or it looks like a cloud actually, you'll put it on the top of that dice. And so it'll go like that. So just like sort of a thematic sense. As you were climbing the beanstalk, you saw clouds galore. As you went higher, even more clouds, right? That's definitely a very thematic sense. But that's what you're going to do. Okay? And then after you have placed it, you'll need to at least wait a few seconds maybe 10 seconds or so, to make sure that it doesn't fall over. And then if it doesn't, then say fee, fi, fo, fum. And if you were able to get one of these tokens onto the beanstalk in your color, you'll automatically get to draw one of these sack of gold cards, placing it there, okay? So that's how you're going to get these. That's one of the ways you're going to get these, is if you manage to get one of these tokens onto the beanstalk, and then it doesn't fall over, you'll get one of these for every one that you did on your turn, which is cool. So if you rolled 2 of those dice that have the sack of gold on it, you'd be placing them both, so it'd be something like this, perhaps, for instance. So then, if nothing happened to your beanstalk, you draw 2 because you have 2 there. So that's what's going to happen if you roll that side of the dice. Now, there's still one more side of the dice that you could possibly roll, and that's this one here, the one that looks like a beanstalk. If you roll this one, you will just put it on to the beanstalk like the rest of the dice, and then you will add this cylinder here, and you'll put the cylinder at the very top of that dice. Now, obviously, I was talking about how the Giant's Castle can show up if you manage to get every single dice on to the beanstalk, whether it's it's on your turn that happens, or somebody else's turn, obviously. But when all of the dice manage to get onto the beanstalk without it falling over, then you get to put the Giant's Castle on top of all of those dice, which is going to go pretty high, probably even higher than my dice tower. It's probably not going to happen because, it's not easy to do so. But there are other ways of doing it. And how is that possible? Well, remember, you have to put a cylinder on these dice if it's the beanstalk, correct? And so if there's only 2 cylinders in the game. So if they are both already on the beanstalk, okay? If they are both already on the beanstalk, and then you roll this, and there are no more cylinders, you'll put your dice on there, and then you'll get to put the Giant's Castle on there. And then if it doesn't fall over, given a certain amount of time, 10 seconds maybe, if it doesn't fall over, you'll get an extra sack of gold, obviously. And then, of course, when the Giant's Castle gets put up there, it doesn't end the game. But what it's going to happen is, after you've gotten your sack of gold treasure card here, you're going to basically take everything off, okay? And then the next player is going to have a clean slate. They're only going to have that there, and they're going to get to start building the beanstalk upward at a lower level. So that's basically what's going to happen if when the Giant's Castle gets put there. You just get an extra card. You just get an extra card by putting it up there, and then everyone else gets to, obviously build up to the castle as well. Okay, now we still haven't talked about what happens if the beanstalk falls over. And there are a couple other things we haven't talked about yet, so let's continue. Now, obviously, that's just 2 ways of the Giant's Castle that can get up there. If you have put all of your treasure tokens, these clouds here, if they are all already on the beanstalk, and you roll this again, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to put the dice, obviously, onto the beanstalk, obviously, and then you'll get to put the Giant's Castle on top of that as well. So that's a 3rd way a Giant's Castle will make it up there if you run out of these, because you only have 3 of these. If you run out and they're already on the beanstalk, then you'll get to put this onto the beanstalk as well. The Giant's Castle, that way as well. So that's another interesting way that can happen. So it really just depends on the luck of the roll of the dice, basically, of what's going to happen on your turn. And then, of course, your dexterity-ness of being able to stack these dice onto the beanstalk as well. It'll also depend on that a lot as well. Now, I didn't talk about 2 other things that can happen. So, each player is going to get one of these axe tokens, okay? And on their turn, at the beginning of their turn, they can use this token, returning it to the box. And then they can throw this axe at the beanstalk. And if anything falls over, those are promptly put back. If it's the dice that fall over, they're going to be put back to the dice pool. If it's these tokens here that fall off, then they will be returned to the players that they're supposed to return to, and the cylinders will obviously come back here if they fall over. But basically, this is a way of keeping your opponents from getting too many points. Because you see, if you throw the axe at the beanstalk one time, you can only do this once per game per player, but if you do it at the beanstalk and they have like, oh, I don't know, if they have 3 of their tokens already on the beanstalk, and it's going to be their turn soon, maybe the giant's castle they'll get to do, right? You can basically try to stop them from getting too rich, if you will. It's kind of an interesting, interactive way of keeping your opponents from getting way too ahead of you if they're doing a very good job stacking, obviously, them on there. That's kind of cool if you do that. May be a little bit mean too, but hey, it's all in good fun. And of course, your opponent will get to do it to you as well at some point during the course of the game, but only one time. So use your token wisely, because you only get the one token, and that's it. Okay? And of course, if you throw the axe and miss the beanstalk, then that's your own problem. That's your own inept ability to throw the axe at the beanstalk. And basically, that's what's going to happen if you use these axe tokens. Now, there is still one other thing to note. So, if the beanstalk falls, what's going to happen? Well, if the beanstalk falls, it basically means that the giant has caught you. So, if you roll 2 eyes, that means basically the giant has caught you, and you don't get anything, right? But if the beanstalk falls on your turn, it's basically the giant has caught you, and now the players who have these tokens on here, so let's say, for instance, I had one of mine on here, and my opponent, they had 2 of these on the beanstalk. Obviously, they wouldn't look like that whatsoever, because there'd be dice between each one of them. But if they had all of these on here, and I was the one that knocked over the beanstalk because of my clumsiness, well, I wouldn't get anything. But my opponents, they would get one of these sack of gold cards for each one of these tokens they had on here. So my opponent, he would get 2 of these for my clumsiness. 2 extra. So obviously, you don't want to accidentally knock it over. Unless, of course, you're going to do it on purpose, then that rule is completely different if you're doing it on purpose. But if you do it on accident, if you do it without the axe, obviously, your opponents will benefit from it, because they're not the ones that caused the beanstalk to fall, and they're basically catching all of the sacks of gold that fall. Basically, that's what they're doing. And of course, you can't catch anything because you are the one that's actually been caught by the giant. So basically, obviously, you don't want that to happen either on your turn either. And so obviously, as the beanstalk gets higher up, that possibility increases that it could fall, and so you'll probably want to just roll 1 dice, if at all possible, if you can, obviously. So there's strategy. I mean, do you want to use the lower cart now so you can go, but maybe later on you won't have the option to roll just 1 dice? So that could be a problem. So obviously there's something to consider than just simply trying to, reveal the lowest number against your opponent here to go first. There's obviously something else to consider. Maybe you'll want to use the 1 dice later on when the beanstalk is getting too tall and you're afraid it might fall over on your turn. So that's obviously very strategic. But then obviously, now there is one other thing to talk about that I didn't talk about yet. There's 7 of these, okay? There are 7 of these action cards. You're going to use 1 on your turn, and each round there'll be 1 less card. So there are 7 rounds, that means. And once the 7th round is over, the game is over. So if that's the case, then the game is over. That's how the game will end, is if you have used all of your action cards. Every player who has used all of their action cards. Another way the game can end is if all of these sack of gold cards here get divvied out to all the players. If this pile empties out which could happen because, there are players who are very good at rolling dice, and maybe they'll roll that one that allows them to just keep rolling dice over and over and over again. So they'll get it all the way up to the top. They'll get tons of treasure cards doing so. It could possible, if you're playing with 4 players, it could be possible that you could deplete this completely with the help of the other players, obviously, before 7 rounds is over, basically. But that's basically how you play the game. Now, I'm going to do a gameplay video to just kind of show you how the game will work more effectively. So maybe that will even be even better to explain how the game works in a gameplay video. We'll see how well I, am able to build this beanstalk without it falling over. We'll see how well that goes in the next video.